Tape starting. Both cameras. Okay.
This is a completely informal and unrehearsed interview with former President Harry S. Truman down here on the Florida Keys at the Olney Inn. Mr. President, how are the plans for the library progressing?
Progressing very, very well. We are within sight of the financial goal which we've been trying to reach. The building is 77% completed, and the building itself will be entirely completed sometime toward the last of April. And we hope to have a dedication ceremony that will be one that will set a precedent on about the 8th of May, 1957, which is a day on which I'll pass another milestone.
Well, you've raised almost $2 million for that yourself, haven't you?
Well, I wouldn't say that I did it myself, but I've been helping to collect about $1,600,000. We're going to need about $200,000 more to finish the thing like it ought to be, but we'll get that without any trouble. All this has been voluntary to a man who was out of office and had no prospect of ever going back, and who was in no position to do any special favors of any kind. They did it because they felt it was historically correct and should be done, and that's a great satisfaction to me entirely.
Do you think it's appropriate for a former president to have to go about raising funds in order to house his official papers?
Well, no, and I'll give you my viewpoint on the subject, and if you've got the time for it, and the reason why it had to be done. The presidential papers of the people of the United States are the most valuable adjuncts to the history of the country, in addition to the congressional record, which is taken care of and stored in the Library of Congress and in all the libraries in the country, and the records of the Supreme Court, which are kept in that beautiful mausoleum up there that they built for the Supreme Court in Washington. All those records are kept as they should be. Presidential records, or presidential papers, if you want to call them that, are sometimes scattered from one end of the country to the other, and some of them have been destroyed, some of them destroyed willfully. Those papers are just as valuable for historical purposes as any other records of the history of the country. I felt, as President Hoover had placed his papers in the Hoover Library at Palo Alto, California, and President Roosevelt had built a library and put his papers in that library and turned them over to the people of the United States, I felt that I would follow the precedent and establish a library to contain these 3,500,000 documents which I have. And that's as many as the manuscripts in the Vatican, by the way. And it will also contain all the gifts that were presented to me as President of the United States. They'll be returned to the people of the United States as they should be, and be the property of all of you. And some of those things are exceedingly valuable, and some of them have great historical significance. And when this building is completed, the City of Independence has given us 13 acres. In fact, they had to condemn 2 blocks of houses that were on the site where we wanted to put the library. The city paid for that. Cost them something over $320,000. And the State Highway Department is spending $500,000 or $600,000 to make an entrance to the situation. So when the building is completed and ready to turn over to the people of the United States, it will be worth about $4 or $4.5 million, which is being made as a present to the richest government in the world. You know, the United States government turns its chief executive, commanding generals and admirals of the armed forces of the United States, and that ought to be true of the executives of the states as well as the United States, not for the federal government to take care of, but the states ought to see that men who serve them in the high executive positions don't have to go out and beg people to take care of them. I ought not to have to go around the country and make speeches to get money to give something to the government of the United States.
And now, a sum of $25,000 a year on which they will have to pay taxes. President, you say in your book that you have certain papers and documents which cannot be released for many years, perhaps centuries. Without pressing you, what kind of documents would those be?
Well, most of those documents are things that refer to individuals who are alive and who probably would be hurt if they were released. Now, the archives contains a great many documents of that sort. There are still a large number of Civil War documents in the archives that have never been released for public observation for the simple reason that the descendants of the people on whom they reflect are still alive, and it would not be fair to them. These documents, however, will be available to historians on a confidential basis under the direction of the Chief Archivist, and they'll belong to the government of the United States to be handled just as other archives documents are handled.
So then they will be available for serious scholars who are doing research, but not for general publication.
That's the point. That's right.
Mr. President, I assume it would be accurate to say that you first came to prominent national attention through the Truman Committee during the war.
Well, it was a committee to investigate the National Defense Program. Some of the newspaper men and the broadcasters named it the Truman Committee, but I didn't.
Well, that's natural for both broadcasters and newspaper men. What would you say were the primary accomplishments of that committee?
Well, that World War, there were 116 investigating committees trying to look into what had happened. Well, it's no use trying to dig up a dead horse and put life into him. The thing to do is to take care of it while it goes on. That was done, and we didn't have any signs of an investigating orgy like we had after the First World War. And I'm inclined to think that that investigating committee, made up of 10 senators, 9 of whom were outstanding men, and the other one was the chairman, did something that helped the country to win the war and to save a lot of scandal afterward. That was the principal reason for its organization, because I happen to know the facts behind the Committee on the Conduct of the War in the War between the States. I also knew the history of the investigating committees after World War I because I was in World War I. And I felt that there was a way to make that a constructive proposition instead of a plan to dig up a lot of scandal after a war was over. The Committee on came about as a result of our own investigations in this special committee. When I was on the Interstate Commerce Commission Committee in the Senate, we had several wonderful investigations which resulted in legislation.
What was the most difficult vote you had to cast, the one that troubled you most?
Well, that's hard to say. I was always in the bandwagon with those who believed the democratic platforms of 1932, 36, 40, and 44 were good platforms and they ought to be implemented. There were times always when it's difficult to vote for the simple reason that it's difficult for an ordinary senator, unless he's on the committee, to get all the facts. It's necessary.
In the vice president being fully informed and briefed on all affairs of state.
I certainly do. I always had the vice president or the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, the floor leaders of the two parties, whenever an important matter came up, they were all briefed in my office by the President of the United States, and their advice was sought. And the Vice President was as familiar with what went on in the executive branch of the government as I was when I was President, and Senator Barkley was Vice President of the United States.
Then, no.
But they had no right to have access to the messages which came from the eyes of the President only.
Mr. President, do you remember clearly the first 48 hours after you became president?
Yes, I'll never forget it, of course.
You say in your book that when you left Sam Rayburn's office to go to the White House, you escaped your guards for the first and only time.
Well, it came about in this way. There was a lot of pending legislation in which the President was very much interested. And Sam Rayburn and I used to have conferences on it after the two houses adjourned. Sometimes he'd come over to the Vice President's office, and sometimes I'd go over there. It happened at this time that I had an engagement with Sam Rayburn to come over there and discuss some legislative matters that are of vital importance. When I arrived at his office, he said, "Steve Early, who was the secretary to the President, is calling you. You better call him right back." Well, I called Steve, and he said, "Come down to the White House immediately and come into the front entrance of the White House and go up to Mrs. Roosevelt's study." Well, I thought the president had come up to Washington to attend the funeral of Bishop Atkins. He was an honorary pallbearer, and that he had something he wanted to tell me while he was here. When I got there, why, Mrs. Roosevelt told me that the president was dead, and that I was now the president of the United States. And in order to get there as quickly as I could, after I'd talked to Steve Early, I went down through the ground floor of the Capitol building and walked across to the Senate office building and missed the Secret Service men. They were waiting for me outside the door where I should have come out. But the driver for the vice president was in the car, and we jumped in, and I went down to the White House. And that's the only time I imagine that I really needed guards while I was vice president, but I escaped them that time, not intentionally, but it just came about. And I never felt badly about the protecting these Secret Service men who protect the president. They are the most able men that I've ever come in contact with in that line. They have a way of protecting the president without making the free people of the United States feel like they're looking at a king or somebody that's untouchable. But they have to do that because the country has a great percentage, not a great percentage, a very small percentage of cranks who would like to do something to any chief executive, not because he's one man or another, the same way with the heads of states in other countries. And they have to perform that duty. Their duties are set out by the law are two. They have to catch counterfeiters who are making false money, and they have to protect the President of the United States, and they're extremely efficient in both lines of business and are wonderful men. I was always glad to have them around, especially after some attempts were made that I did not approve of.
Mr. President, what did you feel when you were told that you were President of the United States?
Well, I was shocked, of course, because big 4 meetings with the President, tried the best I could.
Well, sir, in a period of 3 months, you became president, the war with Germany ended, the nuclear age began, Japan surrendered, the United Nations was created. No one in history ever rode such a tiger as that in such a short time. What sustained you?
Well,
how did you sleep?
Well, I never had any trouble sleeping because when it came time, all my life, I never did have any trouble sleeping. When it came time for me to sleep, I'd go to sleep and sleep. And at this day, I can sit down in a right comfortable chair and take a nap and relax. I guess maybe the conscience part of me is not as strong as it ought to be because I never look backwards. I'm always looking to the front. There's always something ahead of me that ought to be done, and things that are past can't be remedied except by another effort and another decision. And in the words that I get the least kick out of are, I told you so, and it might have been. I think the saddest of all sad words of tongue or pen are these, it might have been.
Did religion help?
Oh, yes, I've always been a Baptist. I was going to say a good Baptist, but it's pretty hard to be a good Baptist. My family are all religious people, and the direction...
You recognized the state of Israel within hours of its creation. Do you have any regrets?
Section of the world has been under dictators for a long time. First the Turks, and then the Russians have taken over a part of Western Europe, which has always been fighting for freedom, and eventually they'll get it. But it's going to take a lot of education. It's going to take a lot of learning to get along with each other. And one of the difficulties in that part of the world is that 3 great religions originated.
When I was in Kansas City, you talked to me a little about the big plan for the whole of the Middle East. Would you like to discuss that?
I would rather not discuss that because I'm proposing to write a series of articles on the subject, and it would hardly be fair if I go into it.
Very good. Heard that war?
Yes, I was. Yes, I was.
The general been advised twice by the Indian representative in Beiping that if we reached for the Yalu, the Chinese would come in?
I don't know.
are in the Japanese position, because the resistance would not have been as considerable as our estimates indicated.
Well, if there's one thing I can say to you, that any schoolboy's hindsight's worth all a president's or a general's foresight. I had that brought home to me very strongly when we were discussing one time in a class in history in high school the Battle of Gettysburg. And one young man got up and said if Lee had done this and that and the other thing, this thing would have come out another way. The old man who was the professor with chin whiskers and a very salty old gentleman said, well, young man, don't you know that any schoolboy's afterthought's worth more than all a general's forethought? So afterthoughts and things after the fact have no effect on making a decision when it's time to make it at the time. You have to work on what you know at that time. And that's what I did, and I'm not sorry for it.
Well,
Not only be your friend, but they'll help themselves to the point where they don't want to jump on anybody else, particularly if they have plenty to eat, plenty to wear.
Would you think the Marshall Plan was perhaps the most significant thing done in checking the spread of communism in Europe?
There isn't any question about it.
How long did you consider that before you announced it?
Well, let's see. It was first broached at Cleveland, Mississippi by Dean Acheson, who read a speech of mine at Cleveland, Mississippi. A short time, that was in May. That was on May the 8th. In June, General Marshall went to Harvard and followed through on it and made that famous speech of his, which resulted in the Marshall Plan. Then, a short time after that, they called in all the leaders of all the chairmen of all the committees in both the House and the Senate, explained the situation to them, and put it over. It was a matter of appropriation of funds to carry it through. And it went through on the basis that there'd be a $17,500 million expenditure over a 4-year period. Well, it was accomplished with the expenditure of about $13 billion in about 3.5 years.
And it was Ernie Bevin who really grabbed the ball and ran with it.
Yes, he was very, very much impressed with the idea because England was broke. We'd already made England a loan on which they had defaulted on the interest, not through any fault of theirs, but just simply because they couldn't pay it. They're honorable people, and a situation was worked out for their welfare and benefit on that subject. But the idea was to save the free world from going completely to a pot and becoming a part of the Russian system, which Eastern Europe finally did become.
And how long did you consider the Truman Doctrine before you announced it?
It was never any doctrine of any kind. It was a policy to save Greece and Turkey from communism. And the objective of that approach was to keep Greece and Turkey from falling into the hands of the Russians so that the control of the Black Sea Straits would still be with the free world. The same situation was true in Berlin. That had to be met, or the communists would have taken Berlin, and if they found out that they could take Berlin without resistance, they'd have come right straight onto the Channel ports. We had to show them that we were standing at the gate, and they couldn't get through when they wanted to enslave people. Now, they allowed the Russians to come through the Bosporus, and it's too bad. They should never be allowed. Peter the Great started to get through there. Up to now, they hadn't gotten through.
This is not merely a communist doctrine that they're applying so far as the Middle East is concerned.
No, it's a doctrine to save the free world.
No, but I mean the Russian penetration of the Middle East.
Oh, the Russian...
In which you did not succeed fully. One was health and the other was education.
That's correct.
Would you expound on that a little?
Well, I was particularly interested that the people who are not in the high-income brackets should have the benefit of all these wonderful things which have been discovered by the medical profession. Under the situation that we labor with mostly is that the ordinary man with a family, and I'm going to establish a health insurance program which would give the ordinary fellow an opportunity to profit by those things for his family, as well as the fellow who had all the money in the world could profit by it. And
for example, an equal opportunity, that our example to the rest of the world may be quite as important as our dollars.
there's none.
Mr. President, we were talking earlier about the Marshall Plan. I wonder if you would tell us again the origin of it and how long you considered before you announced it.
Well, the situation had developed after the surrender of Japan and Germany to a condition where the free world, that is Britain and France and all Western Europe, were in such financial circumstances that they could not restore their industrial plant and could not feed their population. And it was decided after some conversations with the cabinet and other people that some effort ought to be made to establish a revival of the industrial plant of Western Europe and to feed the population while that was being done. And Dean Acheson made a speech which I had expected to make at Cleveland, Mississippi on the subject on May the 8th of that year, 1945, or 6 maybe it was, 1946 in all probability. I think it was 46. And General Marshall made his famous speech at Harvard University on the same subject, only he elaborated on it and covered the ground in a much better shape than it was covered at Cleveland, Mississippi. And then a meeting was called of all the leaders in the Congress. This was the famous 80th Congress, if you remember, of the chairman of all the committees, and the thing was explained to them very definitely and elaborately. And it was explained to them that it would take a 4-year period to put the thing into operation as it should, and it would probably cost about $17.5 billion, which would be much better than seeing all Western Europe and the free world go communist. And they agreed to it. With this medium climate that we have in this part of the world, and that anything then but peace, and then to get modern machinery and know how to work those pieces of land that are still as rich as they ever were, with their tremendous oil reserves. There isn't any reason in the world why that shouldn't be a center of the civilization of the world again as it was in the beginning.
Of course, there is one of yours, do you think, will go down in history as being the most significant, strictly in terms of the constitutional history of this country?
Well, I talked with the Secretary of Defense, who was General Marshall, and with the Secretary of State, who was Dean Acheson, and with Abel Harriman, who is the Ambassador at Large in the establishment of the Point 4 and the Marshall Plans, and with General Bradley, who is the Chief of Staff. We discussed the thing at some length. I listened to everything they had to say, and they expressed their opinions as they should have done. And then I made up, I had no. And the difficulty with the thing is, after they'd looked into the facts and the figures, all of them came to the conclusion that he should have been relieved long before he was.
You were speaking of Johnson's difficulties with his cabinet. You did not always have unswerving loyalty in your cabinet, did you?
No, but I usually got rid of the people who couldn't agree with me and didn't want to go along, and did it gracefully so it would not reflect on them at all. That can be done. A man doesn't have to kick a man out with a headline and spoil his career forever. When members of a president's cabinet do not agree with him, he can sit down with them and figure out a way to let them quit gracefully and then get somebody that will agree with him. General Grant was the most disloyal member of Johnson's cabinet.
Whatever happened to the Morgenthau plan?
Well, it just went out the window. That's about all I can say about it.
You mean with Morgenthau, roughly?
Yes.
Could you suggest the one, let me put it another way, the least successful appointment you made?
Oh, I had a number of people who did not live up to the responsibility, and I don't like to go into details and name names. Those are some of the things I was telling you that should stay in the archives, and I think we'd better let the historians figure that out.
Right. Well, is the essential thing, let's make it on the presidency since you know so much of the history, is the important thing what the man brings to the presidency or what the presidency does to the man?
I think it's what the presidency does to the man. Of course, he must have the background, and he must know something about it and the history of it, and its requirements and things of that sort. But it's like every other great office, from the man who's responsible for running a city or a county or a state. When he arrives at that point, if he has it in him, it does something to him and puts into him the effort and energy to make it a success. And most men come as, or I won't say it to the presidency, I'll say most men, but Woodrow Wilson had a statement in which he said that a lot of people come to Washington and swell up. Those are the ones that have Potomac fever. A lot of people come to Washington, take jobs, and grow up with the job, and that's what most of our presidents have done.
Have you ever tried to analyze what the presidency did to you, Mr. President?
Well, I never have tried to analyze it, but I know the thing that it has done to me and to my family. It's made us so conspicuous that we can hardly do what we want to before or during the time or since. But that's a part of the penalty that you pay, and it's all in kindness. For instance, when I arrived here at Miami yesterday, there were, according to the estimate in the paper, some 2,500 people there. They were all there with a welcome to the man who had been President of the United States and were as kindly as they could be. And I have been in London and Paris and Rome and Venice and all those great cities, and it was the same thing. But they can kill you with kindness just as they can, as well as they can the other way, and it's necessary to have protection in cases of that kind. Now at home, people have always been accustomed to having me around, and they treat me just like they always did. It's the only place in the country where that's the case. Whenever I go to one of the big cities, it's a high compliment, and I appreciate it. But I can't go there as I did when I was a United States Senator or when I was just a private citizen in Missouri. And you want to bear in mind, if you ever become president, that's a penalty you have to pay. You can't hardly be completely yourself anymore.
Well, in retrospect, did your attitude toward the presidency and your own relationship to it change greatly after the 1948 election?
No. I was then felt that I was in a position to go ahead with the policies which I'd tried to implement as president when I inherited the office. I didn't see any difference in the matter, except that I had more trouble getting along with the Democratic Congress than I did with the Republican Congress. On domestic affairs, you understand, not foreign affairs.
Yeah.
I got along perfectly with the Republican Congress on foreign affairs, but had great difficulty with them on domestic affairs. With the Democratic Congresses, I had no trouble with them on domestic affairs and had a terrible time with them on foreign affairs.
For a Secretary of State to negotiate abroad when he's under constant fire from the Congress, for example?
Well, I don't think that makes a lot of difference if he has the complete backing of the chief executive. I don't think the bickering of the Congress has a great deal to do with efforts in foreign affairs when the President is 100% behind the Secretary of State and when the Secretary of State understands what the foreign policy is and where he's going.
But the Secretary of State must act only on the direction and in the shadow of the President.
He must act entirely within the orders of the President of the United States, who is the man to make the foreign policy, and that's constitutional.
Was this the basis of some of your difficulties with Mr. Burns?
Yes, to some extent. You see, I don't want to discuss personalities, but Lincoln had a Secretary of State by the name of Seward. And when the government was first organized in 1861, the Secretary of State, Mr. Seward, had an idea that he was a much wiser and better educated man than the President of the United States, and that he ought to tell the President what to do. I think maybe Mr. Burns had read the history of Mr. Seward, and he tried to operate under the same circumstances, and he got the same sort of a comeuppance that Mr. Seward got. Seward afterwards became a great Secretary of State because he learned that the President is the chief executive of the nation. I'm not so sure that Mr. Burns ever learned it.
But he did have the attitude at the time, as you saw it, that he was running the shop.
That's the point, exactly. He forgot that the President makes the foreign policy of the United States, and he and the Secretary of State must be in complete agreement, or he must be in complete agreement with the President.
Yes.
but the other secretaries of state, they all understood the situation, and there never was any difficulty between me and the men around me that won't tell me the truth, and as they see it, because you can't operate